I get the pleasure of introducing Ben Winchester to our group. I was able to see Aiden and Ben speak this spring, came back to our group and said, I think we need to have them come visit. And look what happened. So I am going to read Ben's bio here. He's been working both in and for small towns across the Midwest for around 30 years. He lives in St. Cloud, Minnesota with his wife and 2 children. He is trained as a rural sociologist and works in the extension department. He does conduct a lot of research on economic, social, and demographic topics surrounding the theme of rewriting the rural narrative. He did receive the Rural Renewal Research Prize in 2021 for this work. He got his BA in Mathematics and Statistics from the University of Minnesota, and also an MS in Rural Sociology from the University of Missouri. He was a founding employee in the Center of Small Towns, an outreach program at the University of Minnesota, and he specializes in community development, demographic analysis, data visualization, and moving communities away from anacadia. Is that how I say it?
Anecdata.
Anecdata. Yeah. All right. With that, thank you, Ben, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben. As you probably know, 4-H is probably the most common example of what you see across rural America when it comes to extension. Hands up if you were in 4-H. Can you raise your hand? Oh my gosh, like 15%. It's great. I wasn't in 4-H. I was raised by extension, but not by 4-H in many ways. I've been with extension for a long time. I grew up in Winona, southeastern part of the state, 30,000 people, and used to think that was a small town, right? And then I went to school in Morris, Minnesota on the prairie in a town of 5,000 people. And I was like, wait a minute, this is a small town, 5,000 people. And then you realize 80% of all the cities in the state are smaller than Morris, smaller than Ely. The most normative community size is around 700 people. So we are built with all these small towns littering across our landscape. We've got these great interactions across our communities that I like to portray. So thank you for being here today and caring about your town so much. My own background, when I went to Morris, my undergrad was in math and stats. I love data. I know, don't walk out. I love data, but I also know many people are scared away by it. So hopefully everything you see and hear today will be consumable and understandable. So you'll see the subtitle here is Speak Softly and Carry Statistics. Like it is all about, if you don't have the data, how do you counter a narrative? So you see the title is actually Rewriting the Rural Narrative. And the premise of all my life's work is that the narrative we're using to describe our small towns and rural places is terrible. And yes, that's great. A lot of work to do on that side. But on the other hand, how did we arrive at this point that I have such a terrible narrative about my town, but on the other hand, I can't find a home to buy? We are highly desirable. Let's explore the ways in which we have not been dying for the past 40 or 50 years, right? So now, we do have a narrative. There's a very common narrative out there around the brain drain. And I'm going to talk quick right away, like in your evaluations, you can just write down Ben talked too fast, right? So this is, so really, where was I going? So there's this narrative that there's a brain drain, and the brain drain, if you don't know, is when your high school kids graduate and a bunch of them leave. 40 to 60% typically do, and we're terming that as a huge problem, right? There's actually a book out there called, I don't think I have it here, but Hollowing Out the Middle. And the implication is like when you lose your high school kids, that your town is hollowing out. And it's really not a very accurate portrayal of where our towns are. And I think when our high school kids leave, it's one thing for them to know that they might not like it there today, but your town is a place for them in the future. If you have a totally negative narrative, they think they're coming, they would have no reason to come back at all, right? So now, meanwhile, what are other narrative kind of mechanics out there that you live in the middle of nowhere? We'll talk about how you can flip that on its head, and we'll talk about living in the middle of everywhere and what that portrays, and where Ely sits in the middle of all of these lives that people have. You have a contact with so many Minnesotans on an episodic basis. Ely has such a positive narrative across this state, whether or not you believe it. You have people in town like, nah, that can't be true. My job here is to, like, my last name is Winchester, right? So I'm going to give you ammo to fight this negative narrative. Because if you don't have the evidence, if you don't have the data or the research, how do you counter it? Like, hey, your population keeps going down. You must be dying. How do you counter that? Your homes are full. How can we be dying and full at the same time? Let's look at that. Not right now, but we will. So then they get back to the narrative. You're a sleepy town that was woken up by the blank, and fill in the blank with like tornado or whatever. But the implication here is that you were sleeping and doing nothing. Everybody knows one another. You don't. Like Dee Dee's got a thing. We're going to come up with this one next. I've got a little exercise for you. Nobody locks their doors. You do. Like somehow there is research out there on this, and North Dakotans have the lowest rate of door locking in the country at 44%. So it's still not nobody, right? So in that the lucky few escape. I mean, these are part and parcel. Kellogg Foundation will tell you whenever you see quotes like this in a newspaper article or a report, that's not the sign of a reporter that's done their job. That's a sign of somebody who's so lazy, they're working upon their stereotypes to describe what they think they see. So let's look at what we are actually going through. So this is the question for Dee Dee. I'm not going to give away the answer right now, but this is a question for you. There is something called Dunbar's number. It gets back to like, you know, everybody in town. Well, this guy actually did research and showed like, you don't. How many people are good friends? Oops, I'm going to go back here. How many people are good friends with you? How many people do you typically have as friends? How about meaningful context? This is the one I'll ask you. Make your best guess right now. It'll be given out during Dee Dee's session. But how many friends do you have? How many meaningful contacts do you have? And it kind of bridges up, right? How many acquaintances and then people you recognize? But just because I recognize you doesn't mean I know you. And in a small town, we're filled with people that are not from here. Raise your hand if you're currently living in the town that you were born in and you have never left. It's like 4%. Okay. Our towns are filled with people that were there and left or are purely newcomers. How many of you are currently living in the community you had no prior like relationship, family relationship with? Who gets to own our towns? Is a real question. Like, are you allowed to say this is my town? These are real things. So let's look at this. So rural communities have been changing. I'm not going to get into the whole how we have not been dying, but I'll say number one, people use population and as your indicator for success and failure, right? And if we're using that, you're a huge failure, right? Because your population is, right, trickled down over the decades, and it seems like nobody wants to live here. But I'll tell you that the average household size in this country has gone down a full person since 1940. In 1940, imagine your town had 10 houses in it, or every table was a house. In 1940, every house would be filled with 3.6 people. And we don't live in fractional people, but you get the idea, right? You have 100 houses, 3.6 times 100. You have 100 houses in your small town. You have 360 people in that town in 1940. But today, the average household size is full person down, 2.6. So now your population is going to be 260. Why? Not because everybody of all ages just left town. Because on average, when you just look at the totality of your homes, you just have fewer people in it. But there's a ton of change coming. We'll get into that. So getting back to the narrative, like if rural communities are dying, show me all the dead towns. They're not around, and for good reason, because we're not dead. We're changing. So I like the Mark Twain quote, rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Like again, show me all the dead towns. Rural's changing. We're kind of in this milieu of changes in this broader world. And so now why is it important for us to understand how the world is changing? Is because this world is impacting every one of our places. This isn't 1850 where it takes 60 years for a trend from France to make it to your small town. It's here tomorrow or later tonight. So now when our communities are being impacted, right? We're in a globalized world. And when our communities are being impacted, we're impacted generally the same. And what's going to differentiate one town from another is how you respond to it. It is social capital, is the one differential that impacts whether you lose more jobs, lose more income or not. That's that differential. So early on in my career, I wanted to better explore some of the data around how our communities were not dying. I started to notice that in the census data, there seemed to be a regular growth of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. So here's a bar chart. I know it might be hard for you to see it in the back, but this bar chart, if it goes to the left, these are 20-year-olds and 25-year-olds. And over 10 years in this time period, 43% of young people left. And this is Grant County, but this is a common example of almost every rural county. And so I was like, all right. And this is like 2002. I was like, yep, we have a brain drain. But then I looked here, I was like, man, there's growth in like 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds in like 98% of all the counties in the country. Even in the panhandle of Nebraska, where they're losing 18% of their population decade after decade, there's still growth in 30 and 40-year-olds primarily. So we do interviews, right? We want to better understand this trend. There's something going on here. And I'm not a negative narrative person. I'm not going to spend my days worrying about the kids leaving. What I want to know is, do the kids have a narrative of opportunity when they return? And they don't. And why don't they? It's because this narrative is massively impactful. How you talk about your place is heard by your kids every day. It's pronounced by your teachers. It's repeated by your leaders. This narrative is invasive and can cause demise for actions. But we're going to get past that and talk about, we've got people moving in. Who are these people? So we do these studies, right? We're in the university. So I had partnered with Nebraska at the time, and we go out, we did interviews. We're going to go out. We found all these people in their 30s and 40s and 50s that had chosen to move in to rural Minnesota and rural Nebraska. And when we ask these newcomers, we've repeated this survey numerous times over the years. You're going to hear an update on this too. When we asked newcomers why they choose to move to a small town, the top 3 reasons were, number 1 was a simpler pace of life, right? Immediate access to recreation, getting away from a commute. If you want a really good schema for talking to newcomers and asking them like how that move went, like ask what were push factors and what were pull factors. Are there things that were pushing you away from where you were? And are there things pulling you to the community that you're going to? And this was the framework from our analysis. So again, simpler pace of life. What we find is the pulls overwhelm the pushes. Safety and security is number 2, especially high with people with children and female-headed households. And the third top reason was the low cost of housing. We're starting to see that rise. We did our most recent study. Housing, as you know, is very expensive. If rural communities were dying, we should have homes everywhere and they'd be super cheap, but they're not. In fact, when you look at census data, it actually looks like you have vacant homes in the county. And right, okay, so one of the biggest caveats we hear, we're going to work with Ely, but we're stuck in St. Louis County data. Right? How do you part out your part of the county and all that? I just want to remind you, we're not going to like nickel and dime all this data down to Ely. We're going to put this in the context of the broader picture. So when we think about like this low cost of housing, there's this interaction between the broader communities, the regional centers, and its outlying communities. What does this look like when people live in one place and work in another? So we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the biggest points that we hit on was people are not moving because they have a job. Just 41% of newcomer households said they moved because they had a job or a job offer. But that's not the primary reason why people are moving. Now, I will walk this back and say traditional economic development is all about bringing in a business. And then when you have a business, that's the motivation for migration. Why would anybody move here unless they had a job? That is the first wave of economic development. We'll talk about that later on. We're in the 4th wave right now. That's wave number 1, industrial attraction. That's the only reason people are going to move here. That number fell. So now, I'm going to use my... Oh, it does. Okay. I didn't want to break it. Okay. So what we have here is in this column right here is our latest newcomer survey that was done in 2019, a year before the pandemic. This survey that we did in Montana was a year into the pandemic. And to better understand like pandemic-related influences on rural migration is what our question was. So those that move for a job, we were at 41% before the pandemic. It's been very consistent, 47 to 41% over 20 years. People are not moving solely because of the job. They look at all of these other things, like imagine what this is. You all have moved in your life. You probably know this, right? Moved primarily for a job into the pandemic, went down even further. fewer and fewer households are saying they needed a local job. And why? Because the pandemic afforded an opportunity for employees to live wherever they wanted. You had employers like, live wherever you want, I don't care. And people did, and they chose to move here. But now what happens? Put housing in your mind through all this. You just had somebody move into town, they don't have a local job, but at the same time, your local employers have a labor shortage. Where's the new labor for your existing employers going to live when the trends are people moving in not to take on the local job, or they may telecommute, or they have a different situation. There's lots of, they don't have a job, or they're retired. So this becomes interesting. Move primarily for a job went down even further, which is why are people moving? Social factors. Let's look at these. Now, the percentage who had lived in the community before, I asked that question earlier because I think a lot of times people see the returnees, right? You like grew up in the town, you moved away, and you came back. And if you come back and be like, man, you came back, I know your dad, you got a familiar face, you got a familiar name, you got social capital, cachet, when you're from there and you return. But if you're not, what's your experience moving to a small town when you don't know anybody? Who's your first interaction? What are you? Lacey. This is a very common issue, though, is we used to have like way more welcoming activities because the post office would literally hand you a list of all the new people and their phone numbers. And we can't do that today. So you have to kind of work around this. You have to find other avenues to find out who moved in and then like opt in, like an opt in, right? I'm going to give you a postcard. And if you're interested in having lunch with Lacey, then you go contact Lacey, right? But it's not a cold call like, hey, I got your number from the post office. Like, that's not going to work. So lived in the community before went up for the first time. So before the pandemic and very consistently for decades before that, 1 in 4 newcomer households were from the town. Just 1 in 4 households are from that community. Put another way, 3/4 are not. But during the pandemic, this number went up for the first time. Lived in the community before went up to 1/3 of newcomer households now were from that town, moved away, and came back. And we weren't really sure what was going on until we did these focus groups around housing. And we found out, how do you find a home to buy in a rural community? You have to know somebody. And why do you know somebody? Because of this other data point, which is now 40 to 60% of home sales are not arm's length transactions. They're not a stranger that puts their house on the market and me, a stranger that goes onto Zillow, a realtor, and then finds your house and then puts in an offer via the realtor. And I never know you. It's called an arm's length transaction. 40 to 60% of home sales today are not that. Like, hey, I know your mom's looking to move out. We've always loved your mom's house. We're going to take you out for supper and bam, 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 I have a house for my son. It's funny until you realize this is the norm. Like, we just heard from a guy who went to a small town, Western Minnesota, to fix up his mom's dilapidated property, which we'll talk about later. And he chipped his tooth. And he goes to the dentist's office and he's like in the dentist chair. And the dentist assistant's like, who are you? Because she doesn't recognize him, right? She's like, who are you? And he's like, I'm Joanne's son. I'm here to fix up a house and everything. And she's like, Joanne? What, she's moving? Bam, bam, bam. That house got sold to that dentist assistant's daughter in 2 weeks. That house never got listed. I work with realtor organizations and they think they're the denominator in home sales. And I say, you're the numerator. You actually don't know anything about all these other home sales that go on. So I will advocate for you to find out more about the parcels that are transitioning in your community to better understand how that happens. And I will say the best place to find a home to buy in rural America is to visit with your seniors after church. So moving on. We're not going to do anything more. So really, I want to call this the brain game. Like, you want to talk about the brain drain, go ahead. But that's not a very fair characteristic of your community, especially when you got people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s moving in. You're in your prime earning years. You've got education, network, social capital, economic capital. You got all these capitals coming out. And then how are you treated? You just need to learn how we do it around here. That's actually a huge approach. Do you hear that? Or are you capitalized on what you want to do? Is your community a melting pot? You just need to learn how we do it around here, melting pot? Or is it a stew? Academically, the alternative to melting pot, right? The melting pot, American melting pot analogy, right? Is that you melt in, but that's like not really fun because I don't know anything about you then. We're all just the same thing. And it implies that you have like a culture here that's well-defined well before I ever got here. And if you look in the literature around like melting pot, there's the salad. And I'm like, I don't really like the salad because nobody like, we're all in the pot together kind of thing. So I like a stew. And I'm a tomato and you're the like mushroom or whatever it is, right? But we're constantly ladling people out, ladling people in, like it barely tastes like my grandma anymore. The broth is the culture. This is the milieu of our community. So for me, this dictates every approach you have. Are you a learn how we do it around here, melting pot? Or are you going to capitalize and build the army of the willing around the stew and where you have your action? So you're the stew folks, by the way. So now, there's been this consistent pattern that we call the brain gain of people in their 30s, 40s, and sometimes up to 50s moving in. And this has been happening since the 70s. So I published on this in 2002, like, well, this is new. And I'm like, not really. Like, why? My point is, why do we not look at that more? Why were we not interested in this? We were more interested in our high school kids graduating and like, what are you doing? Than actually concerned about people moving in and wanting to build their lives here, choosing to move to your town. So now, the first question I get when I say, hey, you got a brain gain, you got all these people in their 30s, 40s moving in is, where are they? They're not in my groups. I'm like, right, they're not in your groups, they're in theirs. But there's an idea out there, and again, the characterization here is that social life is in decline. People don't want to be involved. And in some ways, it looks vastly different than ever before. We have went from like, can't wait to go on Friday night to, oh my God, I'm finally home for Friday night. Which approach do you have? This dictates the life of our town when we want to activate communities. So meanwhile, I've got access to a database, a really awesome database. Say it with me, awesome database. Okay. Thank you. There's a really awesome database. You're going to hear more about it in the nonprofit sector, but I had a basic question at one point, which is how many people do you need to run your town? Like just position-wise. Think of governments, think of nonprofits. So you have like city council, county commissioner rep, township officers, soil and water conservation district, sewer district, cemetery district. You got all of these government groups that actually need people to serve as a leader. We've also got nonprofits. The nonprofit, again, that narrative is that we're in decline. The data I see doesn't show that. So I skipped a few slides here, and we're going to pick on Cook and Lake County because I think it's more reflective of like the pattern up here than to use St. Louis County data for you in this. And what we found as an example, like Cook County, number of nonprofits went from 75 to 79, but there was actually a really big cleanse in here from 2011 to 2014 where they removed a bunch of nonprofits that were dead. They were like out of date in their database. And so there really is a natural growth. The growth that we had seen from 2000 to 2010 was a rise of 20 nonprofits. 20 is a huge number for us. In small towns, creating one nonprofit takes a ton of work. You got to find people with your common interest. You got to create a board, get your 501c3 paperwork, hire a lawyer, copy and paste your 501c3 paperwork from somebody else, and then file your paperwork in for your organization. Not really, but like kind of. No, you're right, you know. Yeah. And you create a group, and now you're active, and now you're doing things. So what this database is a database of every nonprofit in the country. And so what I looked at was the changes from 2000 to 2010 to 2020, and nonprofits keep growing. But the one thing I want to hit on here as an example, again, I don't have the data for Ely. You'll look at the data for Ely coming up. Just a second, though. So really, as an example, again, Cook County, nonprofits went up. But I want to look at this line right below this, which is the number of nonprofits in the county that are filing full 990s. So if you don't know, if you're a nonprofit and you're lower income, you have low receipts, you can file a postcard for your taxes every year. It's like a 1040 easy when you're low income, right? You're filing your taxes. But if you have a certain amount of income, and in this case for a nonprofit, filing 990 means a full 990 means you have gross receipts of $50,000 or more. Then you're mandated to do like the full tax form, right? Now, what do we see? This is across the board. Almost 3/4 of our nonprofits are now filing full 990s. We went from 22 in Cook County to 65 groups that are filing full 990s. And at the same, which means they have gross receipts of 50,000 or more. At the same time, the rows right below here, revenue of these nonprofits doubled from 2010 to 2020. The assets more than tripled from 2000 to 2020. The story for me of nonprofits is growth. Like, we constantly create all these new groups and we're capitalizing them. I don't think we understand the extent to which our community capitals are dictated by our nonprofit sectors. We have a huge amount of resources here. And so while on one hand, I can't necessarily give money to Hardware Hank on Main Street, I donate to our mountain bike association. We just bought a bunch of land. That's an asset. We're building assets. We're garnering revenue in our nonprofit sector, our numbers that are through the roof. We have never seen this kind of growth before. Of course, we don't have a lot of paid employees in rural communities. We have volunteers. So that plays into this as well. So I've got the data here. If you want to look through this, you can look through this later. I do have St. Louis County. They've got full on 1,100 nonprofits that are filing full 990s. So when you look across the state at all the types of nonprofits that they have, I'm sorry for you folks in the back, you really can't see any of this. But the big orange box here, this is all the types of nonprofits that we have. This is religion-related groups. Like it's the NTEE codes, like what activity area is each nonprofit in? So you can have like churches, number one. Churches are number one, hold the biggest proportion almost every state in the country. Number two is sports, recreation, leisure, education, community improvement. I mean, we have a lot of groups here in Minnesota. But there's been a shift. And this is the biggest shift I want you to take away from the nonprofit sub, is historically, individuals would become involved at a community level, a place level, with a broad focus. So a narrow geography with a broad focus, like the Ely Community Betterment Club, right? It just served Ely. It didn't help anybody else around, right? Just served Ely, but it did everything, raising money for the school or the firemen or whatever. Broad focus in a narrow geography. Today, people want to be involved in just the opposite on both axes. Rather than a narrow geography, it's a broad geography. Rather than a broad focus, it's a narrow focus. The North Central Minnesota Snowmobile Association. It's 14 counties big. There's not just one, people just from Ely go into this group. There's 2 people from your town and 3 from your town. And that is how we build our social infrastructure, is across our places in spaces. But meanwhile, your place-based groups are like, where's all these new people at? They don't care about my community. They're not showing up in my groups. And I'm like, you're right. They're showing up in theirs. So what types of groups do we have in Minnesota? Oops. So when we look at just the nonprofits that have been created in the past 30 years, it is not oh, you're new in town. You just need to learn how we do it around here. Like the newcomers are just doing their own thing right off the bat. 56% of all the nonprofits in the state have been created in the past 30 years. We are filled with new organizations left and right. And it's very much out with the old and in with the new. So what types of groups are we creating? Recreation, sports, leisure groups, number 1, by far. Number 2, educational institutions and related, like school activities, could be teacher-related groups, arts, culture, humanities, human services, philanthropy. And like, we're lucky. We are so lucky to be in Minnesota. We have the Legacy Amendment. The Legacy Amendment has spurned so much growth in the civic sector that other states are not even close to achieving. So we're one of the only states that uses dedicated state funds to help our environmental and recreational groups. So if we just look at Ely, here's the different nonprofits that were created in just the past number of years, since 2013. The Igloo Snowmobile Club in 2022, Sportsmen for the Boundary Waters 2018, Into the Brush Incorporated 2016. So again, interest groups, Ely-area, Northeastern, like again, these groups are regional, more so. So trying to get a grasp on how we change by understanding where the motivations are for the people creating the groups today. How are they being funded? Who do they go to for volunteers? All of this becomes a real good question. So I get back to how many people do you need to run your town? In Cook County, 1 in 9 people need to serve as a nonprofit or government leader. 1 in 9. That's like every block has to have somebody sitting on a board. Not who you go to for volunteers or fundraising, but actually need to lead. We have some of the highest demands for leadership in the country, and it's a good and bad problem to have. So on one side, I'm really glad people feel comfortable enough to create all these new groups that reflect their interests, but at the same time, now we're competing with all these other groups. What if our meeting is going to conflict with your meeting now? Like, oh. There does need to be work done on the civic sector to ensure some continuity over time that doesn't lead to distress for the groups in them already, can remobilize and remotivate some of the groups that lost it in years past. So our referrals to you would be to develop linking, bridging, trying to connect groups in any way you can, to have a common language, to have a common calendar. Like, how do people find out about what's new in your region even when you're busy in just your life? So now we can talk about the economy. Like, we don't just live and work in town. Dartmouth did these studies that looked at how big of a region people live in and how far people go to work, and they called it a mega region. And you see, oops, oh, this is going to go that way. So you'll see these mega region connections are huge. And here's kind of the border of community, and then we kind of trickle out on the towns on this side. But really it is. We are filled with these networks of interaction. And I don't know how to say this more clearly, but no town is a one-stop shop. This isn't 1860 where it's like Little House on the Prairie. Like, we went from Little House on the Prairie to not Little House on the Prairie in 12 years through the introduction of roads into this country and the rise of the road navigation. So anyway, mega regions, we live in these mega regions. Even within Ely here, every day, 771 people commute into town from the outside. A quarter of them are 18% of them are commuting more than 50 miles to come into work. Every day, 633 people live in town, leave to go work somewhere else, and a quarter of them commute more than 50 miles. And just 616 people that live here also work here. 50 whatever percent. Do I have that? Oh yeah, 49%. Both live and work in the city. You're not an anomaly. This is part and parcel of normality for Minnesota. More Minnesotans today leave their home county to work than don't. Yeah. How many of you have started driving and then you hit the county line and then you turn because you can't leave it? Right? Nobody? Okay. Our county lines were drawn during the time of horse and buggy. They don't reflect actual behaviors of how people live. But Dee Dee has a wealth of information on this. Oh, we're not even going to get to that yet. So Bridget Tuck in our office also does economic composition reports. And I think part of the story to be told about rural is, I mean, it starts with this. When I would run into folks like from the metro, right? If I'm an urbanite and be like, hey, would you ever consider moving to a rural community? And the most common answer I get is, I'm not a farmer. And it's like, okay, like less than 5%. I'm a non-agricultural rural sociologist. 95% of rural people today are not in ag or an ag-related field. I mean, that's just the reality. But even the top line headline about rural is driven by agriculture. I don't want to be the naysayer here, but we have a healthy mix of economy, education, and health services are our top employers. And have been for 25 years. And we should celebrate the fact that we are more diverse economically than ever before, because we are also protected from economic shocks when they happen as well. So now all these people moving in for the past 30, 40 years, the brain gainers have been diversifying your economy too, buying businesses, starting businesses, sometimes taking over farms or ranches in Montana or whatever it is. But what does it really look like in the economy? And again, Bridget shows that you're right. Any one rural community is not going to have a diverse economy. But even the metro gets to count like 7 to 14 counties in their like thing. So what we find is when you put 5 or 7 counties together, you have the same diversity in your economy that you find in the metro. in terms of jobs and occupation, or in terms of occupations and industries. So like, instead of saying like, sorry, we don't have any jobs for you, it's like, yeah, you can be a blank in rural America and fill in that blank with whatever job you've got. So that is part of this narrative to be told too. So for me, the biggest one is our local businesses. Michael Darger's, where is Darger? Where's he? Oh, way in the back, over there. So Michael Darger's here. He's a hallmark in this area. For decades, I've been working on business succession and transition. And for me, local businesses are your wealth holders. We have watched a massive shift away from locally owned businesses to not locally owned businesses, right? What happens when you go from a locally owned hardware store to the dollar store? It's a job. It's no longer a wealth builder. So we are all about ensuring that your business sector sees and plans for its future. But right now it's like, hey, what are you gonna do with your business? Like, my son's gonna move into town and take it over for me. Then we talk to the son and they're like, I'm gonna do what? Like, this is like, we need an actual plan for how this looks. So Michael's done a lot of really good work on this. There's actually some very exciting models out there that even if you don't have an owner, you might be able to have a coalition of employees that actually could purchase that property and maintain that as a business. So super exciting. We're going to talk about this in one of the breakouts, is the business succession and transition. So really, we don't live in the middle of nowhere. You live in the middle of everywhere, and you put your home in one place and you work in another, and you shop and eat out in these huge, huge boundaries. And this is how we live. So Dee Dee is here. We got, where is Dee Dee? I know I just saw her. She's on. So Dee Dee does work using placer data. It's cell phone data. Cell phone data, I mean, cell phones are ubiquitous at this point. Everybody's got one. And so typically in the past, when you wanted to better understand, like, you know, that live and work relationship, how many people are commuting out every time? If you'll remember, and I'll just go back to this, but if you'll look at this, the date on this was from 2022. So it's like 3 years old, and you're like, I mean, I don't think it's old, but a lot of folks are like, I don't know, it's kind of 3 years old. Like, what happened last month or whatever? Well, now you can find out what happened last month because you have cell phone data. And so cell phone data, you can identify a community center and say, how many people came last week or last year? And from where did they come? Where did they go before that? Where did they go after that? If you're afraid of your cell phone data being shared, like, you don't want to see our database. Because there's lots of really interesting data in this. So one of the things you can do is, we in the past had done this living in the middle of everywhere exercise. And what you would do, and we didn't do it here today, what you do is you hand out a map of your region. So go out like hours out, and then put a star where you live, put an X where you work. And again, that's not always the same place, right? And then draw a boundary around how far in the past year have you gone to shop and eat out? And then another boundary in the past year, how far have you gone to play and recreate? My boundaries are different than your boundaries. You get bigger. My boundaries weren't very big. Yours were way bigger than mine. So what you find, imagine we had all done this exercise here today, this middle of everywhere exercise. What we would typically do in the past is we would take all these maps and you organize them around the room by age. And what you find is that people's region gets bigger as you age, like 20, 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old, 60, and then 70 and 80, and then your dot goes away, right? Like, gotta talk about, well, I'm a demographer, we're gonna talk about death coming up. So meanwhile, you can use that exercise on paper to delineate how far people are going. And you find out some people go west and some people go east. And then how do you talk about your community to others when all you know is your life? And I run into somebody and they're like, oh, I love mountain biking, but I don't mountain bike. So I'm like, I don't know that we got any mountain bike trails around here. You just shot yourself in the foot. Thank you, narrative writer. Like, negative narrative writer. Like, there's nothing to do around here. You live in the middle of nowhere. Not you, really. So meanwhile, this data can get into Placer and give you that cell phone data, and Dee Dee can extract out now, for the people who live in Ely, where did you go to shop in the past year? Top 50 or something locations I think we had looked at here. And so again, nobody's hitting these artificial jurisdictions like the city line and like turning the car kind of thing. We're going all over the place. I think this is one of the biggest realizations I have, is that life is so massively complex, I can't even understand how we understand it at all. There's a term called sonder, which is the recognition that life is inherently complex. And I use this term in terms of, like, imagine you're passing people on the highway, right? And I go from Morris to Hancock, I drive from Hancock to Morris every day. And it's like, boom, there's a car that passes you. And then there's another car. It's probably the same car as you recognize day after day. And then you know if you're late or whatever. But right, it is like you pass these cars. I just want to remind you, every time you pass a car on the highway, that's a whole life with their own problems, their own challenges, their own opportunities, their whole everything of a life. And then you think you know everybody in your town? Like, I can barely understand my own life at this point. Not really, kind of. So Placer becomes a tool we can use to immediately understand the behaviors of our population last week. What did they do? How successful were we? How far now do people have to commute in for a service job, for example? Where is housing more affordable? All of these questions become pertinent in terms of this relationship between visitors, workers, and residents. And that's when I say visitors, that's the bigger part of this database that Dee Dee deals with, is the fact that you have people coming and going around here all the time. And I love this. I love talking about your visitors because these are the people you don't always hear from. Like, I live in Hancock and I had my mom and sister come up twice a year. We would do the same things that we love to do. There was a restaurant we loved, a park that we loved, but nobody in town ever heard about this. How do you hear about how much people love your town if it's only through your experience? We don't really have a good way to understand the extent to which this community has that type of affinity in people's mind. So we live in the middle of everywhere, really. But how do you make decisions at a local level when you live in the middle of everywhere? An example might be like, if I run into the mayor and I'm like, hey, I'm looking to move into Hancock, right? I lived in Hancock. So it's like, I'm looking to move into Hancock, right? And the mayor's like, you're going to love Hancock. We got Buddy's Bar and Grill. We got a full K-12 school. We got a C-store / deli / car sales / hairstylist, you know, on the corner. It's like, yes, I do love that. But I'm also looking at moving to Benson. Oh, and then right away, the mayor's gonna be like, you don't want to move to Benson. They got nothing going on there. Like, Hancock is where it's at. What'd you just do? You live in the middle of nowhere. You can't name off something I might enjoy outside of your town because you think I'm going to sacrifice my whatever it is, hypothetical cost for me going to another town because I love it. This is the reality of how people live. So we are trying to use modern tools for our modern problems. Same with nonprofits. I can't even tell you how much right now we should be spending our time going back to all the leaders in this community that made every decision for the past 60 years that allow you to be still here. I don't think we understand the extent to which our civic sector is run by volunteers. And when this massive changes happen in our world, we have to deal with it and come up with those solutions ourselves. And we did it for decade after decade, but this decade is different. Like, we've got these dynamics. So this is my exchange. I like to provide information to you all about how people are living, working, shopping, and playing. When we do that, we can better understand how the future of our community can be built and what it looks like. So why should you care? We did ask a question. Sorry, I want to do a quick time check here. We had a question in our newcomer survey about, do you believe the community you moved to was welcoming? And it was kind of scary asking that because, like, do you want to know? You do, right? It is. And a full on, like, 78% of our newcomer households did say the community they moved to is welcoming. But there's another question we asked, which was, are you likely to be living in this community in 5 years? So we're really not going to, like, follow up with you. But if you're having a terrible time, you're going to be like, I don't think I'm going to be here in 5 years, right? You don't want to be, kind of thing. So for those that state the community is welcoming, 86% of those households say they're going to be there in 5 years. But those that say the community is not welcoming, it's down to 44%. 44%. Now less than half of these newcomer households are going to be there in 5 years. Your employers don't want to hear that. You got a huge retention issue. And why? Because of your community. In a tight labor market, Labor has power to choose wherever they want. And what's going to differentiate one community from another is everything but the job. What happens when you leave that shop floor? And you just told me about the potential job and the tools I'm going to use and the salary and the benefits. But then I leave that place and I walk into the broader community. And what is that experience truly like? This becomes the work I love doing, and we call it resident recruitment. So on one hand, you have industrial recruitment, right? Bring in the business. Okay. Stop creating jobs, by the way. We have so many jobs, we can't even fill the ones we have. We need residents to come into town and fill those jobs. So really for me, resident recruitment is, I mentioned earlier, the fourth wave. When I go back to economic development, the first wave is industrial attraction. That is, again, bring in a business and then people will move here. Wave two is entrepreneurship. We're going to help you get the skills and then develop your own business in town to do this work. Third wave is around clusters. Might be around cheese in Wisconsin or the medical facilities around Rochester, whatever, kind of clusters of activity. But the fourth is resident recruitment. And this is really everything across the community that dictates whether or not somebody will be a successful resident in your town. So now, why aren't we changing fast enough? And literally, why are we in the condition we're in was our population keeps going down. Like, what's going on? And I'll tell you, 15, 20 years ago, I thought a lot more change was going to happen. When you look at the composition of homeowners in rural communities, this is Cook County, but very typical. This is the baby boomers. You know, there's the demographic snake, right? And there's the baby boomer, the mouse are the baby boomers in, and they're huge. And they're working their way through. And the baby boomers are homeowners. They moved into rural communities, right? They were 35 to 54 in the year 2000. And then 10 years later, that little bump moved over. And then in 2012, when the data came out, I'm like, man, another 5, 10 years, we're going to have a bunch of housing available. Why? Because typically in the past, this is a chart of home ownership rate by age. So as people hit the age of early retirement at 67, historically, 20 to 30% of people would move out of their home and into condos, apartments, rentals. But the point was you're out of your 4-bedroom, 3-bath house and into something different. Move over housing is what it's called. So now, this was the chart I was looking at. It's like, man, once these baby boomers hit that, we're going to have a bunch of housing that'll hit the market. But then it didn't. And why didn't it? It's because this generation today are staying in their homes. 58% of older adults haven't moved in more than 20 years. And why are they staying in their homes? Because there is no move over option available to them in your community. But when you offer move over housing, it opens up the workforce homes that they're in. And they're in your 4-bedroom, 3-bath places right now, and they never go upstairs. Like, ugh. So we have a problem in many ways of the wrong people in the wrong homes. So while you have older people, and I can't even say seniors. Don't say senior. You got to say 55 and older. And I'm 55 now. So it's like me and older. Like, what are the intentions of older adults as they age? This becomes the opportunity for action. So now I'm going to talk about, we see this. Cook County again, from 2010 now to 2020, the only thing that's happened is you've grown the percentage of older homeowners. So this is 65 and older, and this is 55 to 64. Because people in these age groups keep staying in their homes, it inhibits the ability for younger people to move in. It is that simple. You don't have a labor shortage, you have a housing shortage. Because truly, if you have a housing shortage, tell me what your problem is. Or no, labor shortage. If you truly have a labor shortage, tell me what your problem is. You're not paying enough? Your community sucks? Like, what is it? It's housing. So then you need to look at the mechanics of housing and the lack of churn. We call it our churn has been inhibited around housing because of the inability for the older adults to move over. And that inhibits the ability for new people to move in. So when I get back to saying our houses change over one death at a time, I'm not joking. This is it. Kelly Ash, I don't think I have it in here, but yeah, Kelly Ash with the Center for Rural Policy and Development does these demographic studies too for the state and shows now that in the most rural counties in Minnesota that have the highest death rate, they have the highest in-migration rate. So we have a mountain of death. that's going to be changing our communities. And right now, again, more than half your homes are filled with older adults. And a lot of these people aren't even in the job market anymore. So local economic developers don't even see these people because they're not an employee in town. But you're also an income generator because you have old age Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid dollars, sometimes retirement dollars, all of those things play into this. But we know that when people keep living in their homes, it increases the risk of dilapidation for that property. And in fact, we have a whole age-in-place strategy that helps people stay in their homes longer and longer. And I'll say that might not be the best thing for that house or for them at the end. You want to talk about housing, there's a whole nother presentation I have for like an hour to talk about this one thing, but I'm going to give you the highlights, which is right now, nobody is truly responsible for all the housing in your town. I can't even say that loud enough. There is no single agency or government or anybody, right? Housing is a private asset. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your house, but if that house becomes dilapidated to the point it gets torn down, there's a public cost now to private inaction. And what does that look like? So imagine your community had 4 houses in it last year, and each one of those homes brought in $1,000 in property tax revenue. But this year, my neighbor Howard's house had to be torn down because he couldn't take care of it, and he passed away, and we razed it to the ground. So now, if you know how property taxes work, right? You're assessed on the land and the parcel and the property that's on it. But if you tear down the house, you're only assessed on the land. What happens now to the assessment on the parcel when you remove a house? You're assessed at $200 as opposed to $1,000 last year because you don't have a house on it. But who now? The county, right, lost $800 in revenue off that parcel. Does the county reduce its levy because Howard's house got torn down? Like, oh, we better cut it down by $800. Nah. Who makes up for this difference? Everybody else's taxes go up because of the inaction of a single householder. And there's way more cost to that. So initially we're like, man, us doing nothing now has a cost. There's a public cost to individual private inaction in this area. So we wanted to better look at what's the impact then of just having an apartment or a house or a twin home in town. And this doesn't even include the job. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on this, but this shows apartments where you have a household income of $60,000 produce $41,000 at a minimum in economic activity every year. So we'll share a link after this is over with this economic impact of a house. But it kind of goes to show, like, the actual cost of building a home is a pittance relative to the output economically you get from this house every year. So now if I tear down Howard's house, which produces $95,000 a year in economic activity, I just lost $100,000 a year until that house got rebuilt. Our existing stocks are probably one of our primary assets. So I will talk about moving over, providing move over strategies. And the moment you say senior, you talk about like nursing homes. You can't. This is move over housing in the continuum of life. I'm not even going to get to continuum of care. So this is condos, independent living. And what does that look like when you offer those opportunities to move over? People do it and it opens up their home. At the same time, our existing stocks need to be repaired. I am huge on home rehab. Like the house I owned in Hancock was built in 1907, had lath and plaster, knob and tube. I mean, it all had to go. And people right now are surprised when my mom looks to sell her house and the real estate agent is like, ugh, you got knob and tube wiring. Like nobody can get insurance on that. You got to swap that wiring out. And you got peeling paint. There's no first-time homebuyer eligibility with peeling paint. Your mom's got to take care of that house. And I'm like, well, what? It's going to cost like 20 grand to get that done. And then my mom's like, 20 grand? I just spent $15,000 putting a ramp on the house and updating the bathroom. All of these dollars that are being spent in aging right now are not considered from an overall community point of view. It's mostly a livability expense for individuals to stay in their home as long as they can. But the moment I move into that house, I'm tearing that ramp off. There's $5,000 just got thrown away. Be wise investors of your housing stocks by starting with an interview with the people in these homes and what their intentions are. So we're just going to stop that. This is like a huge thing, but The housing one is super interesting. I love the housing thing because this is where you can take action. We are so weak on talent pipeline stuff, electricians, plumbers, all that stuff. You get your high school kids in your senior homes right away. Changing out outlets, doing things. You don't need an electrician or a plumber to do work. You need skills, and that's it. So you want to talk to me about that? I have a sub on Reddit called Home Improvement. That's 4.6 million people on it. And why? Because no question is too stupid when it comes to fixing your home. And people want to know how to keep up their homes. So what are you doing to help ensure that the people that are moving in have an opportunity to even gain access to knowledge, skills, resources to keep their homes up? So, I didn't even do this one. So now, because of all the death, there is a lot of transfer occurring. So demographically, when we talk about that mouse through the snake, right? The mouse through the snake is going to hit a peak, and Aiden will talk about it in the breakout session later. But it's going to hit a peak in about 15 years. And that is peak like baby boomer deaths. It's probably going to happen here a little bit earlier because our rural communities are older. So it might happen 3 or 4 years earlier as we hit this kind of peak death, as baby boomers have peak death, and then I die, nobody cares about. And then after me are the millennials, who are even bigger. And so over the past 20 years, there have been these transfer wealth studies being done across the country to better understand like what's going to happen when mom and dad pass away and our kids aren't here anymore. And all those dollars and all of this wealth that is created by your residents, with your community, with your neighbors, now goes to their kids in Texas. So part of the transfer wealth studies are here to realize like you have so much wealth here. And you guys have so much wealth here. Nonprofit wealth, community capital wealth. We're going to do the whole capitals thing in the breakout there. But part of this is to characterize like you actually have a lot of wealth. And maybe you can actually make an ask to give back to the community at this point. So we do these studies. There's actually a whole initiative called the Minnesota State Share. 5% does a whole lot of good is the name of the initiative, the campaign. It's offered by the Minnesota Council of Foundations. And it's to encourage giving across the state for the next generation, to create an endowment of funds that your communities can then use to help do community improvement projects in the future. Because for us, it's less about like fundraising for the spaghetti feed every year and more about having an endowment that pays for that every year. And then if you don't want spaghetti, you can change it to something else, right? Unrestricted funds, right, on that. So maybe one of the best things you can do for your community is ensure there's somewhere for people to live, spaces for people to engage, and opportunities to own your future. As we move through this, I just want to remind you that of all the interviews and focus groups I've done, nobody said they're moving to your town for pity. To be honest, nobody moving in knows where your community was. They will come to appreciate it, but they don't worry about that the first 6 months. You're worrying about what garbage day is. Like, right? You're a newcomer to a small town. Like you don't have time for that. When the narrative that these newcomers are writing is terribly positive, you're moving here for hope and opportunity every day. So with that, I just want to say thank you for being here today. It is up to you to carry the ball forward with all of this. And I just love having this exchange of like, ask me questions now. Like, what about this? Like, because as you've seen, like, all of these questions I've had, honestly, have been the result of communities asking, like, what about this then? And what about that then, right? So thank you for being here today. It's really my pleasure to serve you through the state and through extension. And I'll turn it back to Lacey. Thanks.
Do you have a minute?